Breaking news, ICE and DEA agent exposes Cjng and Sinaloa takeover of rural America tone the Montana crisis.
Charged after a series of carjackings, shootings, robberies, and assaults in Philadelphia and Montgomery County. The suspects are between.
What happens when one of the world's most dangerous cartels quietly walks into one of America's safest states and no one notices until it is almost too late? That question hangs heavily over Montana, a state known for its mountains, its silence, and its belief that danger exists far beyond its borders. But in 2025, as President Donald Trump maintains an aggressive national security posture, federal investigators warn that the real threat may not be entering through the southern deserts, but through quiet highways, rural roads, and overlooked tribal lands. And when the truth finally surfaced, it shook Montana to its core. How could a region 1 to 300 miles from Mexico become a cartel hub? The story begins with a faint disturbance, isolated overdoses, unusual cash flows, strange newcomers in construction crews, and whispers across reservations. The warnings were subtle, almost too small to matter, but the pattern was unmistakable. Retired and active federal agents now describe it as America's most silent infiltration, a deliberate strategic move by transnational criminal organizations who believed Montana was the perfect place to plant a flag. Why? Because no one expected them to. According to investigative documents and testimony gathered over years, the transformation began quietly. Federal court filings revealed arrests tied to machine gun smuggling networks reaching from Atlanta to the Rocky Mountains. A man named Humberto Lopez appeared in Colorado courts accused of coordinating weapon flows and managing high-volume drug routes, a glimpse of a much larger architecture. While national media focused on cartel battles along the Rio Grande, the real shift was happening far from cameras. The first cracks appeared when DEA agent Stacy Cjng, newly transferred from combat zones in Afghanistan and jungles in Peru, arrived in Montana expecting a quiet assignment. Instead, she found the unmistakable footprint of an expanding operation. What she discovered contradicted every assumption Washington had made about the geography of America's drug war. Cartels weren't just slipping across the border, they were embedding themselves deep inside rural America, exploiting the blind spots of law enforcement and the complacency of communities who believed they were immune. As Cjng later described, drugs that sold for a few dollars in major cities were fetching up to $100 per pill in remote Montana. Towns profits so extreme they reshaped cartel strategy overnight. Reuters recently confirmed that cartel groups have increasingly targeted rural states with low law enforcement density, citing high-margin, low-risk corridors emerging across the northern United States. BBC and DW both noted that Cjng and Sinaloa have shifted tactics, globally expanding into regions where institutions are weaker. Oversight is lighter and resistance is minimal. Montana matched every criterion: miles of remote terrain, underfunded tribal police, only 4 DEA agents covering the entire eastern district, no southern border spotlight, just quiet open ground. The turning point arrived when Cjng realized the cartels were no longer testing the waters, they were firmly, deliberately operating. Transport crews rotated constantly, vehicles changed routes, shifted, and money pickups moved with surgical discipline. Agents described being 2 steps behind every time, as shipments leapt from one reservation to the next, moving with military precision. According to federal records, cartel networks hit the Flathead Reservation, the Northern Cheyenne Billings Crow Agency, and back into Wyoming before any agency could lock them in place. The implications stretch far beyond Montana. If a cartel can establish stable operations in a remote, sparsely populated state, what does that say about America's internal defenses? What does it reveal about the balance between civil liberties, tribal sovereignty, and national security? And what does it mean for Washington's global standing, especially as international media scrutinizes whether the U.S. can secure both its borders and its heartland? The human impact was devastating. Rising violence, overdoses tripling, Native American communities overwhelmed, federal agents watching networks grow faster than they could respond. The Guardian and Al Jazeera both reported that rural opioid deaths across North America have surged far more quickly than in major cities, a trend Montana exemplifies with heartbreaking clarity. What began as a whisper had become a storm. Now, as 2025 unfolds under a renewed national security agenda, Montana stands as a warning to the rest of the country. If a remote state with vast open land can be infiltrated so quietly, what happens when the next network chooses a larger, more strategic target? And how prepared is America to confront an enemy that no longer needs to cross the southern border to get inside? The warning signs were scattered, at first too subtle for most to notice, too quiet for local authorities to treat as anything more than routine. But one person recognized the pattern long before it broke into full view, a DEA agent whose career had been forged in the world's harshest drug battlegrounds. The question now is unavoidable. How did a veteran of Afghanistan's opium war peruse jungle networks and the Mexican border end up uncovering one of America's most alarming cartel footholds right in Montana? Her name was Stacy Zinn, a federal agent whose resume reads like a global manhunt. While many in Montana assumed the state was insulated from the chaos shaping the international narcotics trade, Zinn arrived with a different lens, one sharpened by years confronting traffickers who move faster than governments, adapted quicker than intelligence networks, and treated borders as mere inconveniences. According to case files and agency interviews, she had stared down cartel operatives in El Paso safehouses, survived a direct assassination threat, and spent years embedded with FAST, the Foreign Deployed Advisory Support Team, advising U.S. missions against Taliban and Al-Qaeda-linked drug operations. Her background mattered. Unlike many agents reassigned to rural states, she understood how cartels think, how they expand, and how they identify vulnerabilities. And when she stepped into Montana in 2014, she instantly recognized a familiar quiet one that usually precedes a storm. Federal agents later described her arrival as the moment the lights came on. She asked questions that others had not. Why were overdose clusters increasing in remote counties? Why were Southern-style trafficking patterns emerging so far north? Why were construction crews shifting demographically? Why were reservations reporting unusual outside visitors? Her instincts sharpened after a conversation from her early career resurfaced in her memory. A cartel member once told her something that struck her as arrogance at the time: Mija, if there was no demand, we wouldn't be sending it. Years later in Montana, the meaning became undeniable. Demand was rising, and Montana's isolation was no shield. Reports show that by 2018, Zinn became the first woman ever appointed as Montana's DEA resident agent in charge. What she discovered wasn't a trickle, it was a system. Transport crews conducted quiet strikes, hitting one reservation, then another, sweeping through Billings, gathering cash, vanishing into Wyoming, and resurfacing weeks later under new identities. Law enforcement barely caught a glimpse before the operation changed shape again. International media have since confirmed that cartel networks are moving into regions that combine high profit margins with low institutional resistance. Reuters notes that Cjng and Sinaloa both expanded into rural corridors across North America between 2020 and 2024, capitalizing on communities with limited law enforcement density. Defense News and Jane's Defense Weekly report parallel trends. Decentralized criminal groups increasingly operate like paramilitary forces, mobile, adaptive, technologically supported, and deeply embedded in civilian environments. For Zinn, Montana was not an exception, it was a blueprint. Her analysis revealed several glaring vulnerabilities. 1. Limited DEA presence. Only 4 agents covered an area larger than Germany. 2. Underfunded tribal police. Officers stretched across massive distances with little support. 3. Legal complexity. Reservation sovereignty created pockets where cartel actors could operate with reduced risk. 4. Enormous profit margins. Pills costing just cents in Mexico sold for up to $100 in Montana's remote towns. 5. Geographic isolation. Help arrived slowly. Traffickers moved quickly. BBC and DW highlight how transnational criminal groups thrive in environments where law enforcement coverage is thin and interagency coordination is fragmented. Montana fit that profile perfectly. Zinn's warnings intensified when she noticed a rise in Hispanic construction workers arriving around 2017, an unusual demographic shift in certain towns. Soon after came the unmistakable signs: new vehicles, frequent border-to-border trips, increased cash flow, new transient populations, and eventually unmistakable Cjng signatures. Montana was no longer a quiet assignment, it was the newest front in a growing shadow war. Her superiors initially faced skepticism from political leaders who viewed the state's distance from the southern border as a natural buffer. But the numbers didn't lie. Arrests increased, trafficking networks expanded, cartel presence became more overt, and the state's overdose rate began a steep climb that aligned with Zinn's timeline. The larger question now takes shape. How does a single agent become the first line of defense in a state larger than many countries? And what does it say about America's internal security structure when transnational criminals can identify vulnerabilities faster than federal institutions can reinforce them? Cjng's early findings would soon explode into full-scale investigations, cross-border intelligence sharing, and a national reckoning. But at this stage, one thing was already clear: Montana was no longer a safe distance from global crime. It was the battlefield. If cartels could quietly infiltrate a state like Montana, what other gaps in America's interior remain unseen, and who will find them first, federal agents or the criminals exploiting them? What happens when a state becomes more profitable to a cartel than an entire American city? And what if that state, sprawling quiet and thinly protected, doesn't realize it until the damage is already unfolding? That is the central question behind Montana's transformation from a remote frontier to one of the most lucrative drug markets in North America. Because for the cartels, Montana was never an accident. It was an opportunity mathematically perfect, strategically simple, and devastatingly effective. The driving force behind this shift was economics, not ideology, not chaos, pure profit. According to investigative records and DEA briefings, the numbers were enough to redraw the entire map of cartel expansion. A counterfeit pill costing 25 cents to manufacture in Mexico could sell for $100 in remote Montana towns, a markup so extreme that no cartel could ignore it. In cities like Denver, Seattle, or Phoenix, oversupply had driven prices down. Markets were saturated, risk was high, competition was brutal, but Montana was untouched ground. BBC and Reuters have repeatedly reported that transnational criminal organizations are shifting their strategy from high-risk metropolitan hubs to quiet rural corridors where enforcement is minimal and margins are exponentially higher. Montana fit this emerging pattern perfectly: a vast geography with only scattered law enforcement, understaffed tribal jurisdictions, and a population that had spent decades believing it lived outside the reach of the global drug trade. To cartels, especially Sinaloa and Cjng, this wasn't just a market, it was virgin territory. And as DEA files show, they entered with precision. Early trafficking patterns followed predictable loops: hit one reservation move to Billings stop at northern Cheyenne, gather money, disappear into Wyoming, then resurface days later under new identities. Every loop brought in more profit. Every quiet, successful run encouraged the next. Agents across multiple counties described these early years as a game of shadows, an operation always visible only at the edges, never long enough to intercept. The profit margins weren't the only reason. Geography played its part. Montana's vast wildlands offered dozens of entry points, hundreds of hidden routes, and countless back roads where traffickers could move undetected for hours. No border wall, no checkpoints, no surveillance towers, just open space. As Jane's Defense Weekly notes, criminal syndicates prefer low observation corridors, and Montana's landscape offered some of the largest in the United States. Then came the demographic shift. Around 2017, Cjng noticed an influx of Hispanic construction workers, an unusual change that triggered her instincts. She suspected what was later confirmed traffickers were inserting operatives under legitimate cover. They blended into newly forming labor communities, built relationships, and in time moved into the reservations. There, the next phase of the plan unfolded. Montana's tribal reservations carried a vulnerability no cartel could overlook: jurisdictional complexity. Local police couldn't arrest tribal members. Tribal police often couldn't arrest outsiders. State authorities required formal agreements to operate on sovereign land. This created a legal no man's land where criminal actors could move with reduced risk. It wasn't chaos, it was structure. Exactly what cartels love. By 2018, Cjng had formally entered the state. Their methods matched what Al Jazeera and DW have documented across Latin America and Europe: infiltrate underserved communities, form personal relationships, build loyalty through coercion or dependency, then turn homes into distribution hubs. In Montana, this meant infiltrating reservations, partnering with vulnerable women, and later using those homes as bases. The predatory logic was chilling but effective. Meanwhile, the demand soared: isolation, economic pressures, lack of treatment centers, a young demographic in certain counties. As overdoses rose, the market became self-sustaining. Cartels exploited each vulnerability with ruthless efficiency. But the most alarming element was strategic, not economic. As fentanyl became the dominant export, cartels realized they no longer needed massive networks or physical territory. They needed only routes, safe houses, and customers. Montana offered all three, and as CNN, The Guardian, and BBC have all reported on the broader US fentanyl crisis, the pattern became clear: small towns were becoming the new battlegrounds. This shift carries major national implications. When profit determines expansion more than geography, no state is insulated. When a remote region becomes more profitable than a major city, the cartels follow the math, not the headlines. And when federal capacity is stretched thin as it is in Montana, with only 4 DEA agents covering half the state, the enemy gains time, space, and momentum. Which raises the most urgent strategic question of all. If Montana's extreme profitability made it a priority target, what other rural regions across America could become the next silent gold mine? And are federal agencies prepared to stop that expansion before it begins? What happens when a criminal organization discovers a loophole in America's legal framework so large that it creates a safe haven inside the United States? And what if that loophole sits at the heart of communities already burdened by poverty, limited policing, and decades of federal neglect? That exact question now defines one of the most disturbing chapters in Montana's cartel infiltration, because the reservations were not merely targets, they became the cartel's perfect sanctuary. Montana has 7 federally recognized reservations, each with its own government police force and sovereignty. To most Americans, this sovereignty is a symbol of identity and history, but to cartels like Cjng and Sinaloa, it became something else entirely, a legal blind spot, a shield, a system where multiple forms of law enforcement overlap, conflict, or simply cannot act. The results were devastating. Files and field interviews reveal the pattern clearly. Traffickers first tested the reservations with small drops. When nothing happened, they escalated. Transport crews hit one reservation, drove to Billings, then slipped into the Northern Cheyenne community before looping into Wyoming to deposit cash. No single agency had full visibility. No single tribe had the resources to track them. No state authority had consistent jurisdiction. It was the perfect storm, and the cartels knew it. To understand why the reservations became ground zero, the legal reality must be laid bare. Local police often cannot arrest tribal members inside reservations. Tribal police often cannot arrest non-native offenders. State authorities typically cannot act without tribal permission. Federal authorities, too few, too distant, too overstretched. Cartels saw the gap and stepped through it without resistance. DW and The Guardian have both highlighted how criminal syndicates worldwide look for jurisdictional fractures, areas where law enforcement responsibility overlaps in ways that delay action. In Mexico, this means disputed territories. In Europe, it means border zones. In the United States, tragically, it means reservations. The infiltration followed a meticulous pattern. 1. Target vulnerable women. Stephanie Iron Shooter, Montana's American Indian Health Director, described it plainly. They know who to choose. Traffickers formed relationships, moved and blended into households, then converted those homes into bases. Cjng and Sinaloa have used similar marital infiltration tactics in Central America, a method Reuters recently documented in multiple regions. 2. Build local dependency. Cartel operatives offered free initial supplies to struggling residents. Addiction followed. Debt followed addiction. And once in debt, individuals became distributors, drivers, or lookouts. Entire families were pulled into a cycle they could not escape. 3. Exploit policing limitations. When outsiders committed crimes inside reservations, tribal officers faced limited authority. Even when cooperation agreements existed, response time was slow, backup was scarce, and federal agents were often hours away. Cartels operated with impunity. 4. Establish distribution hubs. Homes on reservations became logistical centers, a quiet hidden web supporting statewide operations. The trafficking routes were shockingly consistent: Blackfeet, Crow Fort, Belknap, Northern Cheyenne. Each community reported unusual visitors, rising overdoses, and new forms of organized exploitation. By 2022, the situation had spiraled into a full-blown crisis. The Blackfeet Nation declared a state of emergency after 17 overdoses in a single week. Tribal leaders told federal investigators that an entire generation was at risk, a warning echoed by The Guardian, which reported rising overdose disparities between Native Americans and white rural populations nationwide. Federal response escalated. Operation Overdrive, a DEA initiative, targeted high-activity zones. Crow reservation investigations led to 27 federal convictions and the dismantling of the spear-sighting network, which had direct ties to Cjng. But the victories were costly, slow, and incomplete. The system itself remained vulnerable. Meanwhile, the human impact grew unbearable. Families fractured, children entered state custody, community leaders pleaded for resources that never arrived. According to Montana Attorney General Austin Knudsen, the state saw a 20,000% rise in fentanyl seizures since 2019, a number that underscores both the scale of trafficking and the magnitude of demand. BBC and Al Jazeera documented similar patterns in Canada's First Nations communities where organized crime leveraged isolation and inadequate law enforcement to expand northern drug routes. The parallels with Montana were undeniable. This raises a strategic national security dilemma. How should federal agencies honor tribal sovereignty while preventing transnational criminal organizations from exploiting it? How can reservations receive protection without surrendering autonomy? And what does it say about America's internal security architecture when the nation's most vulnerable communities become the first line of defense against international traffickers? Montana's tribal nations now carry a burden they never asked for: a frontline position in a war created far beyond their borders. Their struggle is not only a criminal fight, but a moral one, a battle for cultural survival, community dignity, and the right to exist without foreign criminal predation. If the cartels could exploit a legal blind spot in Montana's reservation so effectively, what other overlooked weaknesses across America might already be under threat, and who will close them before another community reaches its breaking point? What happens when a hidden drug pipeline grows so rapidly that an entire state's overdose rate nearly triples, and entire communities begin to collapse under the weight of a crisis they never saw coming? Montana now faces that reality, a catastrophe shaped by greed, silence, and one of the fastest growing cartel expansions in modern American history. The numbers don't just tell a story, they scream. The first shock came from the medical examiners. Between 2017 and 2020, Montana's opioid overdose death rate nearly tripled, rising from 2.7 per 100,000 residents to 7.3. Native American communities suffered the worst impact, their overdose rate becoming more than double that of white residents. BBC and The Guardian both report similar disparities nationwide, noting that rural indigenous communities experience some of the most severe and underreported overdose crises in the United States. But Montana's surge was unique in speed, scale, and concentration. Then came the seizures. Montana Attorney General Austin Knudsen announced the most staggering figure in the state's history: a 20,000% increase in fentanyl seizures since 2019. That number is not a typo. It reflects a tidal wave of narcotics moving through the most sparsely populated region in the continental US. What once trickled now poured in at industrial levels. Federal investigators soon discovered why. In 2024, DEA agents exposed the largest drug bust in Montana history, a trafficking ring linked to the Sinaloa cartel, responsible for moving over 2,000 pounds of meth and 700,000 fentanyl-laced pills into the state across 3 years. They laundered almost $3 million in the process. 15 people were indicted, but law enforcement officials warned this was only one node in a larger organism. It was not an isolated empire. It was one of many. Reuters and DW have reported repeatedly that Sinaloa and Cjng have adopted a franchise model across North America, seeding smaller groups that operate semi-independently but feed into larger financial networks. Montana was no exception. As soon as one network fell, another appeared, new faces, new strategies, same source. The most alarming shift came in 2022, when Zinn instructed her team to focus on a more aggressive actor, Cjng. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel is known internationally for its militarized discipline, rapid expansion, and brutal enforcement. Defense News has described Cjng as one of the most technologically adaptive cartels in the world, operating with encrypted communications, decentralized cells, and paramilitary training. When Cjng began embedding itself in the Crow Reservation, the consequences were immediate. The DEA, FBI, and Bureau of Indian Affairs launched an extensive investigation that resulted in 27 federal convictions and the takedown of the spear-siding trafficking organization, a local network working directly with Cjng operatives. But agents quickly realized something chilling: every time Cjng lost a foothold, it simply rebuilt in another pocket of the state. Meanwhile, overdose clusters exploded. The Blackfeet Nation declared a state of emergency after 17 overdoses in 1 week. Hospitals in Billings, Great Falls, and Kalispell reported unprecedented surges. Families across tribal nations and rural ranching towns faced a wave of loss unlike anything in recent memory. Montana's State Crime Lab reported 80 overdose deaths in 2023, compared with just 4 a decade earlier. The curve wasn't rising, it was detonating. Al Jazeera and The Guardian both highlighted a troubling trend across North America. Cartels are turning remote communities into silent expansion corridors. Less police presence, slower emergency response, fewer treatment centers, higher economic stress, the perfect formula for dependency and domination. The human cost was unbearable. Children found unconscious beside parents. Grandparents raising entire households alone. Tribal elders watching generations disappear. Small-town police officers responding to scenes they were never trained for. And in the middle of all of this, Montana's law enforcement structure remained critically understaffed. The DEA had only 4 agents covering the entire eastern portion of the state, hundreds of thousands of square miles. The cartels had more transporters than the DEA had personnel. Federal prosecutors, including U.S. Attorney Jesse Laslovich, issued repeated warnings. These are transnational criminal organizations, highly resourced, deeply embedded, and as dangerous as any group in the world. The implications now reach far beyond Montana. When overdose rates in remote regions rise faster than in major cities, and when cartels can transform sparsely populated territory into a profitable hub, the national security stakes escalate. Reuters notes that fentanyl trafficking is no longer a southern border problem, it is a continental network spanning Mexico, the US, and Canada. Which raises the most urgent strategic question yet. If the deadliest expansion of cartel influence can happen in one of America's quietest states, how long before another rural region becomes the next epicenter, and what will it take for the country to confront the threat before it spreads even further? What happens when America concentrates its defenses on the southern frontier only to discover that the cartels have quietly built a second doorway into the country through the north? And what if that doorway stretches across 545 miles of wilderness mountains and frozen terrain where law enforcement is outnumbered, visibility is low, and surveillance is thin? That is the new danger emerging in Montana, a northern border threat far more advanced, silent, and strategically alarming than Washington expected. For decades, political debates and federal deployments centered on the US-Mexico border, fentanyl seizures, human trafficking, cartel violence. But while the nation looked south, a new reality unfolded above Montana, a reality DEA agent Stacy Zinn recognized early. According to her interviews and federal filings, the northern border was becoming a parallel infiltration route exploited by criminal networks collaborating across Mexico, Canada, and the United States. The warning signs appeared in 2017. Zinn noticed disturbing intelligence migrant encounters in Montana's northern sector had surged from 866 in 2021 to over 852 in 2023, a nearly tenfold increase. Reuters later reported that Canada had become an increasingly important staging ground for synthetic drug production, with several super labs discovered in British Columbia. These labs used formulas identical to those used by Mexican cartels, indicating cooperation and shared chemistry networks. DW and The Guardian each published investigations showing how criminal groups adapt to enforcement pressure by diversifying routes. When the southern border tightens, they shift north. When ports are monitored, they move through land. When cities increase patrols, they pivot to rural corridors. Montana's vast rugged terrain offered exactly what the cartels needed: dark space. On Montana's northern boundary, there is no wall, no dense patrol grid, no high-tech surveillance towers. Instead, agents must rely on snowmobiles, ATVs, aerial patrols, and a handful of outposts. A natural border wall, some call it mountains, blizzards, and desolate plains. But natural barriers also provide natural cover. Traffickers exploit storm cycles. They move under cloud layers. They use backcountry trails known only to locals and hunters. Federal agents told investigators bluntly, "We can't be everywhere. They only need to be somewhere." What Zinn feared most was not just drug trafficking, but something more catastrophic. As she described in internal reports, the possibility of a dirty bomb or high-value contraband entering through the northern border haunted every operation. This is why she coordinated with Border Patrol, Canadian law enforcement, and federal agencies, forming a tri-national intelligence network that had to be built from scratch. Canadian authorities were simultaneously expressing concerns about organized crime within refugee flows and temporary worker programs spaces cartels could use to position operatives. Al Jazeera, BBC, and The Guardian all reported rising cooperation between Canadian and Mexican criminal groups sharing supply chains, personnel, and production techniques. Montana, situated between these emerging networks, became a pressure point in a continental system. Meanwhile, the realities on the ground grew harsher. Only 4 DEA agents covered Montana's entire eastern district, hundreds of thousands of square miles. Tribal police were chronically understaffed. State officers often worked alone across enormous rural stretches, and border agents confronted not only smuggling operations but bitter weather-limited air support and vast stretches of blind terrain. Cartels saw weakness. They exploited it methodically, slowly, quietly. As the southern border became heavily militarized under President Donald Trump's renewed enforcement directives in 2025, traffickers increasingly used Montana's northern corridor as an alternative. Jane's Defense Weekly notes that decentralized trafficking networks often choose pressure release routes, secondary pathways activated when the primary becomes too costly. Montana became that release valve. Intelligence briefings identified 3 major emerging threats. 1. Northern synthetic supply chains. Canadian labs, some cartel-affiliated produce, precursor chemicals, or finished product then move shipments south. This mirrors patterns seen in Australia and Europe, where cartels diversify production sites to evade interdiction. 2. Human trafficking and transient cells. Migrants arriving through unconventional northern crossings may include cartel affiliates or coerced couriers. Border Patrol warns these groups blend into rural communities, forming temporary micro-cells. 3. Multi-route trafficking strategy. Using both borders simultaneously reduces detection. When the US focuses resources on one, the other becomes an escape valve. This dual pressure approach mirrors tactics used by militant groups in other regions, as noted by Defense News. The strategic implications for America are enormous. How does a country secure 2 massive borders simultaneously while honoring tribal sovereignty, civil liberties, and local governance? How does it prevent transnational organizations from exploiting jurisdictional cracks? And how does it maintain global prestige when criminal networks prove capable of bypassing the world's most powerful law enforcement system? The human toll in Montana continues to rise. Families shattered by addiction. Tribal nations overwhelmed. Small towns consumed by fear. Residents now understand that this crisis did not come from somewhere else. It came directly through the cracks of a system unable to defend its most remote communities. Which leads to the final haunting question. If cartels can infiltrate Montana from both the south and the north and embed themselves in the state's legal, geographic, and human vulnerabilities, what will it take for America to recognize that this is not a border problem but a national one, and will action come before the next silent pathway opens? Montana's quiet landscape concealed one of the most alarming criminal infiltrations in modern US history, as President Donald Trump's 2025 national security strategy focuses on border enforcement. Federal investigators warn that the cartels have already bypassed traditional routes and embedded themselves deep inside the American interior. The transformation began with small signals overdoses, unusual cash patterns, new faces in construction crews, but soon revealed a sophisticated network led by Sinaloa and Cjng. DEA agent Stacy Zinn, whose global counter-narcotics experience spanned Afghanistan, Peru, and the Mexican border, recognized the threat first. She uncovered how cartels exploited Montana's vast rural geography, extreme profit margins, and the legal blind spots of tribal reservations. These vulnerabilities created near-perfect conditions for distribution hubs, predatory recruitment, and rapid expansion. Overdose deaths tripled. Fentanyl seizures increased by 20,000%. The Blackfeet Nation declared a state of emergency. Federal agents dismantled major trafficking rings, but new cells reappeared quickly, adaptive, decentralized, and deeply entrenched. Meanwhile, Montana's northern border emerged as a second infiltration route, aided by Canadian super labs and thin law enforcement coverage. This crisis now represents a continental threat, proving that America's vulnerabilities extend far beyond the southern border. The question remains, will the nation act before another silent